How male slaves were exploited. 5 horrifying secrets. Behind the pages of history, there are untold stories of unfairness and cruelty that are often overlooked. The exploitation of male slaves. In this gripping video, we'll unveil the horrifying secrets that have long been concealed and shed light on the unimaginable suffering endured by these forgotten souls. From gruesome labor to untold sexual subjugation, here are 5 horrifying secrets of how male slaves were exploited. The dark legacy of breeding farm. This shameful revelation confronts the existence of breeding farms, which is intricately connected to preceding acts of sexual abuse and exploitation. As the winds of change blew with the rise of the abolitionist movement advocating for an end of slavery, the declining slave trade posed a daunting challenge for plantation owners. To address the labor shortage and sustain their lucrative operations, they devised a sinister solution, which is breeding farms. These breeding farms were evil establishments that exploited the sexuality of enslaved men. Rather than viewing them as human beings, they were treated as mere objects for reproduction. Strong and healthy enslaved men were forced to have sex with women to make them pregnant. The slave masters, who were driven solely by profit, didn't care if these women were the mothers, daughters, or relatives of the men. Each day, these men were compelled to have sex with at least 6 women to increase the chances of pregnancy. In his 1845 memoir titled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved African, provides insights into the unimaginable challenges faced by African men held in bondage. Among the horrifying practices he witnessed was the forced sexual exploitation of these men, used solely for breeding purposes. Douglass paints a vivid picture of the suffering and dehumanization they faced. Another first-hand account comes from Charles Ball, an enslaved man from Maryland during the early 19th century. In his memoir, Slavery in the United States, a narrative of the life and adventures of Charles Ball, Ball shares the heart-wrenching stories of family separation and the traumatic ordeals endured by enslaved individuals, including the brutal slave breeding system. This cruel practice eventually gave rise to the term motherfucker, a distressing phrase used to describe the agonizing act of forcing a male to engage in sexual relations with his mother. The men who were in charge of these farms, responsible for impregnating the women, often suffered from sexual exhaustion, and their relentless demands took a toll on their physical and mental well-being. The harsh truth of breeding farms stands as a stark reminder of how far humanity can descend when consumed by greed and power. It emphasizes the pressing requirement to address the historical inequities endured by enslaved individuals and strive for a society that embraces empathy, equality, and respect for all. Number 4. The horror of castration and genital mutilation. The barbaric practices of castration and genital mutilation were inflicted upon an enslaved man as punishment for being discovered in bed with his master's wife or daughter, or for being accused of being married and having an affair with an enslaved woman who drew the sexual interest of a merchant or slave master. Such punishments aimed to strip away any semblance of pride and dignity from the enslaved men. During the era of slavery, the castration of African men was a widespread and cruel practice. One example that highlights this brutality occurred in 1822 in Georgia. Cato, an enslaved man, was castrated as punishment for allegedly having a relationship with a white woman. These horrifying acts were not isolated occurrences, but a calculated pattern intended to instill fear and silence any form of resistance. Enslaved men who showed leadership qualities or dared to rebel were deliberately chosen for castration. By depriving them of their reproductive capabilities, white masters aimed to undermine their authority and diminish their perceived power. This brutal practice of castrating and mutilating African men was a cruel tactic employed to crush their spirits and strip them of their human dignity. Number 3. Brutal buck breaking. In the depths of the Caribbean and some parts of the Americas lies a disturbing practice known as buck breaking. This barbaric act showcased the dark intentions of white supremacists, slave owners, and merchants. It's a twisted form of sexual abuse aimed to humiliate and emasculate male slaves in a public spectacle. As slave rebellions gained momentum, the popularity of buck-breaking surged. The ritual began with the enslaved men being forcibly stripped of their clothing, their dignity ripped away along with each garment. They are flogged mercilessly before an assembled crowd, and their bodies bore the physical scars of their oppressors' brutality. Regarding buck-breaking, undeniable evidence emerges from historical accounts. One such compelling piece of evidence can be found in the narrative of Frederick Douglass. This influential narrative sheds light on the practice and its devastating impact on enslaved men. Douglass provides a vivid first-hand account, leaving no room for doubt about the existence and brutality of buck-breaking. In some instances, these men, who cherished their roles as fathers and husbands, were compelled to engage in sexual acts with one another, with their families forced to bear witness to this appalling spectacle. The bonds that held their loved ones together were shattered as they endured the anguish of seeing their fathers or husbands violated before their eyes. At the same time, the burden of shame and despair proved unbearable for many enslaved men who underwent the brutal process of buck-breaking. This weight of immense suffering made certain individuals reach a point where they could no longer endure and made the heartbreaking choice to bring their own lives to an end as they sought to release from the relentless torment that had been inflicted upon them. In contrast, some were fueled by an overwhelming longing of liberation and took a daring leap into the unknown, forever disappearing from the confines of their oppressive existence. Number 2. Entertainment sex. Enslaved men endured yet another abhorrent form of exploitation as they were subjected to sexual objectification and used solely for the entertainment and gratification of their oppressors. This form of degradation further amplified the depths of cruelty that existed within the institution of slavery. Many white supremacists, wealthy merchants, and aristocrats indulged in the perverse pleasure of using enslaved men as objects for sexual entertainment. These men were subject to a range of degrading experiences where their bodies and sexuality were exploited for the amusement of their captors. Enslaved men were frequently paraded naked, lined up for the lustful gaze of their white viewers. Their physical attributes, including their sexual organs, became subjects of mockery, laughter, and vulgar discussions. The very essence of their humanity was reduced to a spectacle, objectified and devalued for the entertainment of those in power. This degradation reached even greater depths when enslaved men were coerced into performing naked dances, where their bodies were exposed and vulnerable. They were stripped of their autonomy and agency, and forced to participate in demeaning displays that further reinforced their subservient status. In the most extreme cases, enslaved men were forcibly made to engage in sexual acts with enslaved virgins, serving as a twisted form of entertainment for white viewers. Number 1. Rape. In the disturbing reality of slavery, it is important to acknowledge that sexual assault is not limited to women. Evidence shows that even men face similar horrors. During that era, Jacobs, a significant voice at the time, highlighted the horrifying reality of sexual exploitation endured by male slaves. One particular disturbing incident occurred in 1787 in Maryland. At gunpoint, 2 white men coerced an enslaved man to commit a degrading sexual act against a free black woman. This shocking violation inflicted immense harm on their bodies and dehumanized them in the most profound way. The violation of enslaved men was distressingly prevalent, especially in southern United States and Cuba, where these regions served as hotbeds for such heinous practices, flourished under the Spanish slave system. Enslaved men endured unimaginable horrors as they became victims of sexual assault in a multitude of settings. The ships that carried them across the treacherous waters became haunting chambers of exploitation, where their innocence was cruelly stolen amidst the vast expanse of the ocean. In the Caribbean, there were hidden sex farms and plantations where slave owners with homosexual tendencies committed unspeakable acts of abuse. Enslaved men who dared to rebel against their oppressors often faced a cruel fate in which death became a consequence of the defiance, a chilling testament to the absolute power wielded by their tormentors. In this distressing environment, men endured additional torment as they were coerced into engaging sexual acts with their masters' wives. This exploitation took advantage of the vulnerability created by their master's absence. These white mistresses, who were captivated by the African male slaves' remarkable physical prowess and strength, shamelessly exploited their bodies to satisfy their desires. The power dynamics of slavery twisted even the most intimate aspects of their lives, leaving the enslaved men caught in a web of powerlessness and degradation. Outro. As we reflect on these heartbreaking stories, let us strive to ensure that the voices of the oppressed are heard and their stories are never forgotten. So don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below, and check out any of the videos showing on your screen for more intriguing videos.